and welcome to How to Get Ready for PHP 8. I'm Sebastian, and PHP is turning 25 next year, which means that I'm using PHP now as a developer for something like 22 and a half years or something like that. And 20 years ago, I started to contribute to PHP in the form of bug fixes and documentation and things like that. And 19 years ago, I started to work on PHP unit. And when I'm not working on open source, which I still like to do, and I spend as much of my spare time on that as I possibly can, when I'm not doing that, most recently, I'm trying to explain to European politicians and administrative people and people working for the European Commission what open source really is about. And when I'm not doing that, I actually have to make a living. And I do that through consulting, coaching, and training. I help PHP teams build better software. For that, I co-founded a PHP consulting company 10 years ago. We have our anniversary this year, and I'm not going into more sales pitchy stuff than that. We have a website as of last week, and we even have a new website. Have fun, look it up, and find out who that person is standing at the front babbling about PHP 8. So, in case you did not know, today is October 23rd, 2019. If you did not know that already, congratulations, you have already learned something. Try to be funny. I'm a German, doesn't always work that way. So what I mean by that is, today is October 23rd, 2019. Active support for PHP 7.1 ended 10 months ago. The PHP open source project has two variants of support. When a new version comes out, there is 2 years of active support for a new PHP version. Active support means all problems that we find, all bugs, all security fixes, we try to fix, security issues, we try to fix them. Active support for PHP 7.1 ended 10 months ago. That means at the moment, if a bug is reported for PHP 7.1, it will not be fixed unless it is a critical security issue. Security support for PHP 7.1 ends at the end of this year. That usually means that in the first or second week of January, there will be the final bug fix release for PHP 7.1, if and only if there is a security issue that needs fixing. Active support for PHP 7.2 ends in 2 months. That means the last version with real bug fixes, like bug fixes that are not related to security, will be made like in the first or second week of January. And maybe you are beginning to see a pattern. Sorry for being repetitive, but sometimes this needs to be done to actually hammer knowledge into the heads of people. Security support for PHP 7.2 ends at the end of next year. Active support for PHP 7.3, currently the latest and greatest, at least for 5 or 6 more weeks, more on that in a bit. Active support for PHP 7.3 ends at the end of next year. Security support for PHP 7.3 ends at the end of 2021. What am I trying to say with that? If you are not on PHP 7.2 or PHP 7.3 at the moment, you have a problem, or you may have a problem. You have a problem if it's a hard problem for you to upgrade to a version of PHP that is currently supported. And there are always these extreme anecdotally examples that I can give. Because, for instance, we have worked with a customer in the United States last year, where for the last 2 years, most of what the developers were working on was upgrading from PHP 5.2 to PHP 5.4. And that turned out for them to be a really hard problem. Because, surprise, if you do not update your stack within 10 or 15 years, or if you only do that every 10 or 15 years, then every 10 or 15 years, you are in a very deep hole that you have to dig yourself out of. Whereas if you do this continuously and upgrade to the latest minor version every year, or every 1.5 years, then yes, there will be a hole that you have to dig yourself out of, but that hole is maybe a foot deep and not like a kilometer or to the center of the earth or whatever. So, and in case you are in doubt about which version of PHP are currently supported, there is this really handy website, php.net/supportedversions.php, where you can see which versions of PHP are currently supported, how long are they supported, and if you're really unlucky, you can also get the information when the version of PHP that you are currently using died. Right? Life is too short for old software. And especially for an open source project such as PHP, it's really, really, really hard. And let's face it, it's almost impossible for a project that is run by volunteers. Nobody is paid to work on PHP, for instance. It's really hard to maintain more than one version. We do it. The PHP project does it. It maintains more than one version. It maintains 2 versions at the same time. And that already puts a lot of stress on people. So, sorry, we cannot do more than that. Talking about some nicer things for a second, before we talk about the really bad things, and before we get to the really nice things in detail. Next month, we'll see the release of PHP 7.4. We are currently at a stage where we recently released probably the second to last release candidate. It may even be the final release candidate, depending on how many problems we find in there. But usually mid or end November of each year is when the new minor version of PHP comes out. So last year it was PHP 7.3. This year it will be PHP 7.4. Next year will be special, because next year will be the year of PHP 8.0 at the end of the year. More on that in a bit. So the point that I was trying to bring across with all these things, like next month we will see PHP 7.4, and in 2 months the support for that version will end, and at the end of next year the version support for that will end, and so on, is that ever since the release cycle of PHP 5.4/PHP 5.5, we have a reliable schedule. Before that, it was very Wild Wild West, cowboy-style release management. There was no way to know for a company that builds software using PHP, or a company such as Red Hat that packages PHP for their Linux distribution, to know when a new version of PHP will be released. Because people were working on new features, were fixing bugs. All of that happened in CVS head at the time. To people in the audience that have never used CVS, congratulations, count yourself lucky. You missed out on a very frustrating piece of technology. I remember I was really happy when Subversion came along, and I was really happy when I got rid of Subversion. But back in the day, people were adding new features, fixing bugs, making major changes in CVS head, which is more or less the equivalent to master branch in Git. But there was no timetable. Nobody knew, okay, when do we do a feature freeze? When do we want to release all of that? And this was frustrating for everybody involved. It was frustrating for the people at Red Hat who wanted to package a new version of PHP, because it happened quite often that the PHP project would eventually release a new version just a week or two or a month after Red Hat had made a feature freeze for their Linux distributions. So they missed out on that. And it took a long time to catch up. It was also frustrating for everybody who contributed to PHP, because they implemented a new feature or an optimization that they really needed, because otherwise they would not have implemented it. They managed to share it with the world, sort of, by getting it accepted into CVS Head. But they didn't know whether or not they would have to wait 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, 2 years, until this change that they contributed would make it into an official final released version. That is no longer the case. We changed the way the PHP project releases new versions a while ago, like a long while ago by now. And ever since PHP 5.5, there is this steady rhythm of every year, one minor new version, and it's very predictable. While I do not believe that a programming language can follow semantic versioning in the same strictness as a library or a tool can do, the PHP project strives really hard to follow on the ideas of semantic versioning, meaning we have 3-digit version numbers, major, minor, bug fix. If you are more mathematically inclined, that would be X, Y, and Z. If you are more into emojis, it looks more like this. Yeah, oh my God, everything is going to fail, everything is going to break. That's the major version number. Everything is awesome because I get new features and everything keeps working as it did before, is the minor version. And PHP is sick and we need to provide a patch to fix it. That's bug fix level, that's patch level, that's the Z. So as I mentioned, a new minor version is released every year in Q4, unless there is a new major version, which we will get next year. A new minor version has 2 years of active support, meaning all types of bugs will be fixed, followed by 1 year of security support. And every time a new major version is released, people get really, really scared. Oh my God, everything is going to break. How can I deal with this? And a lot of people, unfortunately, deal with this by not dealing with it, by sticking their head into the ground and hoping that this new version of PHP will not catch on, that they don't need to think about it, that everything is fine the way that it is, until 10 years later they realize, oh, we are missing out on a lot of stuff. Don't even start looking at things related to security or privacy or GDPR, whatever. Suddenly we need the latest version, and then if you skipped one major version, for instance, that's not going to be fun. So the lesson that should be learned from that is upgrading the version of PHP you use must not be a rare event, because if it is a rare event, if it's something that you only do like every 5 or 10 years, then that rare event is something that you are scared of. And I've seen it firsthand. Developers are not at their best when they're scared. So the only remedy to that is to do it often. Do it once a year, once every 1.5 years. Find a good rhythm, align your release cycle to the release cycle of PHP. Make sure that you are prepared when the new version of PHP comes out to upgrade, to be able to upgrade to it. don't get me wrong, I'm not recommending that on release day you will go and install PHP 8.0.0 or this year PHP 7.4.0. I mean, it's well tested by now because as part of the steady release schedule, we also beefed up the quality assurance of the PHP releases. So the assumption is that 7.4.0 will be stable enough to be put into production immediately, but you don't have to. But you should be prepared to do that at the point in time when you want to do it. You must not think about upgrading your PHP stack as a special project. It's not something that should be a special ticket somewhere in your issue tracker somewhere, but instead it should be part of your normal operational procedure. It should be, some people call it, or some people recently coined the term cyber hygiene, because everything you prefix with cyber becomes suddenly really important. So we already know for centuries that hygiene is important, so cyber hygiene is important. And that means keep your dependencies fresh, use sane, reasonable, latest, fresh versions, and don't try to run your business on a 20-year-old version of PHP in 2019. And I'm not making that up. I've seen that. I already mentioned that. Make it part of your normal operational procedure to every once in a while upgrade the version of PHP. And this is not limited to PHP itself. This means the framework you build your application on top of. This means the dependencies that you use. Make it part of your normal development process to, at regular intervals, look at your dependencies and update them. This should be a role in the team. It should not necessarily be like one developer is responsible for all the version upgrades. No, that should be a rotating role from sprint to sprint maybe. But somebody needs to be responsible to do that. And don't mix commits to version control that update dependencies in Composer.json with other changes in PHP source code. Don't do that. Unless API changes, then it's okay and necessary. But just like always, don't mix different topics in a commit. And again, talking from experience, people do that and then run into rather interesting problems when they want to revert such a commit. And yeah. So there is no need, fortunately, for a crystal ball or some other kind of magical device to know what the future holds for the next version of PHP. Because it's open source. At every point in time, you can look at PHP's Git repository and look at the news file, at the file named news, and at the file named upgrading to see up-to-date information on what you need to know to upgrade your existing code to that new version of PHP when it comes out. Why can you look at that at every point in time? Because nobody in the PHP project would want to write that file, which at the time when a new release is made, which represents 1 year of effort into new functionality and optimizations and cleanup, to write that file from scratch on release day or day before release day. No, that file is continuously updated every time an important change is made. So you can just go there, look at the file, keep up to date. And you do not even need to do that, because in the perfect world, in your development environment, you work with error reporting set to -1 in your PHP INI configuration file. -1 means complain about everything that PHP can complain about. This includes warnings, notices, deprecations, strict violations, etc. turn it on, figure out where your code currently would not work with the next version of PHP, and fix it. In most cases, those fixes can be made within a couple of minutes. So talking about these backward compatibility breaks, what are the things that you can and should do today to be prepared for PHP 7.4 and PHP 8, most importantly? Going to show you some examples now. And most of these things have been deprecated for quite some time. To be fair, for some of these things, we only ever mentioned, yeah, that's deprecated, at some point in time is going away. But we never actually deprecated it in PHP's code, so you never ever got a deprecation warning until recently. Whatever recently may mean. So for instance, one of the new features of PHP 5 when it came out 15 years ago or so, if I remember correctly, was that you could name the constructor of your class __ construct. In PHP 4 and in PHP 3, the name of your constructor was the name of the class. And we intended people, starting with PHP 5, to only ever, going forward, use __ construct as the name of your constructor method. However, we failed to mark the old way, the PHP 4 style constructors, as deprecated when we released PHP 5. And we forgot it or decided not to deprecate it in 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, 5.4, 5.5, 5.6. And only in PHP 7.0 we finally marked it as being deprecated. Ever since then, you get a deprecation warning, but you're only going to see it if you configure your PHP accordingly to see these deprecations warning. Hence, my advice from earlier, configure your development PHP environment in such a way that you see all these warnings. So, I really hope nobody has PHP 4 style constructors anymore. Right now, they still work. You get a deprecation notice, yes, but it still works. In PHP 8, you will not get the deprecation notice anymore. And it will no longer automatically execute this method. So your code will stop working. So now is the time to fix that. This was also deprecated a while ago, calling a method that is not declared statically. I don't know why you would want to do this, but it was possible. And then we figured out it's a bad idea to allow this. And then we documented at some point the fact that we think it's a bad idea in code by marking it as deprecated, and now it's going away. This is really bizarre, because the syntax at the top was never intended to be there in the first place. That's more or less an unintentional feature of the parser of PHP 4 and PHP 5. And while cleaning up the compiler for PHP 7, we found that, or somebody found that. And we decided just to deprecate it at the point in time and not hard remove it, because apparently people use that. Nikita wrote this really useful tool where you can declare a search expression on an abstract syntax tree for a PHP program and then fire that up to GitHub and look at all repositories on GitHub that use PHP and search for a pattern of syntax. And that was being used, so that's why we deprecate it now. So anyway, apparently what that means, you were able to cast $variable to unset, which does not make sense because unset is not a type. But surprisingly, not only did that not yield a syntax error, but it has the same effect as calling the unset function on that variable. So if you want to unset a variable, use unset and don't cast to unset. The track errors configuration directive has been removed, which means that the very, very special variable PHP_error message is no longer available. I have to say that at some point in time I knew that this variable and that configuration directive existed, but since I never used it in over 20 years, I was always surprised that it exists when I came across that, when I came across code that uses this when doing a code review. And I always had a hard time wrapping my head around why, what, and how, and usually that code can be rewritten in a way that is less confusing, and now you have to rewrite it because that functionality is going away. If you really need to know what the most recent error was that was triggered, there's the error get last function. But before you refactor your code from the syntax construct that no longer exists to one that still exists, think long and hard whether you really need to make runtime decisions based on errors that previously happened. Chances are very high that you do not want to do this. In most cases, you either can delete that code and nothing bad will happen, and if you still need it, exceptions are a much better way of achieving what you probably want. Constants can no longer have case-insensitive names, which means that the third argument for the define function may no longer be true. To be honest again, I didn't know that define has a third optional argument which could be used to allow case-insensitive names for constants. I don't know why you want to have that when the rest of the language is not. Well, anyway, it's been cleaned up and all is well. Talking about constants. Since forever, PHP had this fallback mechanism where when you used a constant that is not declared, it would on the fly create a value that has as its contents the name of the constant that was not declared. Which I always found confusing. And since PHP 7.2, that at least is no longer just a notice, but a warning. A warning with the message, stop doing this. It will stop working in PHP 8. And in PHP 8, as you can right now get it from Git, code like that will no longer work. It results in a hard error, which I think is really good. Back when PHP 5.0 came out, for the short period of time between PHP 5.0 and PHP 5.1 development, we thought it would be a brilliant idea to implement class loading in a way that you have the option to have one global function _autoload that is called as a callback with the name of a class when that class is used for the first time and does not exist. This is the origin story of autoloaders as we know them today. Turned out really quickly, once PHP 5.0 was out and people were starting to use autoload, people realized, oh, the vendor of that library, they define an autoloader. and they define it in a file that they own in the global namespace, because that's the way it works, and that name is __ autoload. That conflicts on the one hand with all the other libraries that I pull in as dependencies, and it conflicts with my very own autoloader that I use in my own application. So turned out that idea was not as good as we thought it would be. Well, the idea of autoloading is good, just the idea of how we implemented it was rather limited. So in PHP 5.1, we introduced a stack of autoloaders that is no longer a special name for a function, but you can just call SPL autoload register and provide as many autoloaders as you want. And you have a stack, and PHP will ask the first autoloader that was registered, do you know this class? No, you don't know it? Okay, I try the second one. You know the class? Great. Take care of loading that and continue. So I really hope that nobody is using __ autoload anymore. And it's been at least 10 years since I've seen that in the wild, so I really hope that nobody's going to be affected by that. If you use set error handler, you have to update your usage of that function to register error handlers, because the fifth parameter is gone. This is not really a big issue. This should also be no big issue, because if you want to use anonymous functions in your code, because they're great for things like sorting and callbacks and stuff, you should have already been intrinsically motivated ever since PHP 5.3 to use the new syntax, because it leads to code that is more robust and quicker to execute. In the old days, we had create function. I mean, we still have create function. That is why we're talking about it here today, because it's going away, finally. But create function, if you use create function to create an anonymous function, you need to pass create function two parameters which are strings. Strings that cannot, without executing the code, be validated whether or not they contain correct PHP syntax. That is the problem with regard to robustness of the code. The problem with regard to performance comes from the fact that every time you want to create that anonymous function, that code needs to be compiled again, because it's just a string. If you use the modern way of declaring anonymous functions, the bytecode that function is compiled into can be cached, just like any other PHP bytecode. Not so if you use create function. So in PHP 8, create function is finally going away. If you still use it, refactor your code. The old way of iterating arrays is finally going away. Yeah. One of the really big features of PHP 4, 19 years ago, was the for each operator. So that you do not have to use reset, list, each, and manually implement for each behavior. If you still have that in your code today, congratulations, you have been missing out on one of the biggest improvements of PHP 4 for almost 20 years. And you chuckle and you laugh, but when that change to deprecate each went into PHP, the next day I had failing tests for PHP unit on Travis with the nightly build of PHP. Because in a source code file that is part of PHP unit, that at that point in time I had not touched in over 15 years, there was still that one usage of each. And at first I thought, okay, yeah, nice. interesting, funny that I still have that. How long can it take to refactor that? 1 minute, 2 minute tops. 3 hours later, I was finally done. Because that code needed a complete rewrite. Because it was modifying the array indexes where you were iterating over while you were iterating over it. And it was so obscure that I did not see it on first glance, or second glance, or third glance. It's really confusing code that you do not want to have. So I really hope that you're all using for each and not reset list each to iterate over arrays. So, and if you do, get rid of it. Starting with PHP 8, numeric array indexes will work differently when you have negative integers. And I know that's very vague and obscure, and the example I have over there is very explicit. At least I think it is, to get the point across what changed in actual behavior. But to me, it's really hard to put that piece of code into words. So what does the example do? We create a fresh array. That array initially has one element with the key -2 and the value a. Then we add new elements to that array without specifying the key, so PHP automatically assigns a key. Prior to PHP 8, if we start like here with -2 and we add another element, it would not use -1 for the next element that it's added without an explicit key. It would use 0 because 0 is the lowest one that is still free by default. And I really hope that nobody has code out there that is affected by this change, because that would be really confusing code to work with. I think the new behavior makes much more sense if you start with -1 and want to add an element, then the next element has -1 as its key. Again, if you're affected by this, I'm sorry, but take this as an opportunity to clean up code that probably confuses at least some developers on your team every time they look at that code. The default error reporting level is now EALL. That means it now includes some more things than before. I don't know what it was before. Why do I not know such simple things as that? Because ever since I can remember, my error reporting is configured to -1, so I get always everything, even when a new category of PHP errors is added. Because what error reporting has as its value is a bit mask, and -1 flips all the bits, which means I always get everything, even if a completely new category is added one day. And display startup errors is now enabled by default, so you'll always see errors like, I could not load that extension that you wanted me to load from the configuration file. Something that is really confusing for some developers because they are really sure that they installed an extension like, I don't know, pcoff or opcache or MongoDB. I have installed it. Why is it not there? When I run my application, I get undefined class, blah, blah, blah. And I don't see an error message. Yeah, you don't see an error message because display startup errors is configured to off, and you don't see cannot load, la, la, la. That's good. So, but it's not all things that are going away or are being broken and behave differently. We also get some nice new features. So what do we get? For me, the big feature of PHP 7.4 is typed attributes. That's one less location in the code where I am not able to put type information, optional type information to be more correct. So for instance, in PHP 7.3, we may have code like this, a class that represents an email address, a value object, it's immutable, it's self-validating, you cannot create it without a valid email address, and so on. And internally, we store that email address as a string, but we cannot write private string $email. We have to fall back to annotations in code comments to mark this as a string. And the IDE knows how to work with that. Static analysis tools like Psalm know how to work with that, but it's not nice. And I get no runtime error when I try to put something into that attribute that is not a string. So with PHP 7.4, we can finally add type declarations to attributes of classes. And like I said, that's one more location in the code where we can put this optional typed information. For me, depending on how I count or how do I think about this, there's 2 or 3 more things missing from the type system that I would really like to have. I would like to have at least the option to declare types for local variables, which could sometimes be useful. I'm missing typed arrays. I would really like to say this is an array of foo objects. Right now, I use collections instead, type safe collections that I generate using a code generator, because I'm too lazy to always write the same code. And I would not have to write that code all the time from scratch for each type I want a collection of if we had generics. So that's something that I'm missing. And beyond that, union types would be nice, intersection types would be nice, maybe a mixed type would be nice to make it explicit in code. I have thought about what the correct type for this value would be, and I was not able to make it more specific than mixed. Sometimes that would be useful, especially when cleaning up and modernizing legacy code, and just make it explicit. I have thought about this. This is not missing by accident because nobody looked at it. This is mixed. I cannot be more specific than that, and just document it in code like that. That, of course, all falls into line with PHP's type system evolution over the last couple of years. Ever since PHP 5, the PHP language has provided more and more options to put type information on values. And this is a concept that is known as gradual typing. You're not forced to put that type information in there, whereas other programming languages force you to always annotate your values with a type. No, it's optional. I mean, from a language perspective, it's optional. If you ask me, as somebody who writes PHP code, for me, it's not optional. I always put all type information there into the code that I can. And I'm looking really forward to 2 years from now when I can require PHP 7.4 for PHP unit and I can get rid of all of these doc blocks with the type information for attributes. That will be a glorious day when I make that commit. Makes me very happy. And we're getting more into a situation where it is possible, and possible not with a lot of effort, at least in new code. It's a lot of effort to achieve that in 20-year-old legacy applications with millions of lines of code. But we are now in a situation where we can write code that is type safe, where through static analysis, be it in the IDE with PHP Storm or with a tool like Psalm, through static analysis and type inference, figure out for each variable, for each parameter, for each return value, what is the type of that value that is being passed around, and to detect problems due to not matching types before running the software, even before running unit tests, for instance. And of course, the more type information I have in my code, a certain type of unit tests is no longer necessary because PHP takes care of those type checks. I encourage each and every one of you to go to the talk of Matthew Brown tomorrow, the creator and maintainer of Psalm. In my opinion, the most important addition to the PHP tool ecosystem over the last couple of years. It's the best type checker that we have, and it's a really good tool to work with. And I started using it a little bit over a year ago, and I'm at the point where I still can imagine working without it, but I do not want to work without it anymore. And if you want to take it to the extreme, at least if you are the developer of a library that is commonly used, and let's say you use Psalm to type check and enforce the type safety of your library code, and want to make sure that people that use your library in the correct way, you just depend on you are using it wrong in your Composer JSON file. And what happens then is, let's say I have a library that I published on Packagist, and you have a project, an in-house project, and you want to use my library. You install my library through Composer, and Composer downloads it, it puts it into vendor, updates the autoloader, blah, 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 everything as usual. Composer will see, oh, I installed as a dependency of the dependency I wanted to install, Rove, you are using it wrong, and that thing has configured a hook that is executed after the package has been installed. And what you are using it is wrong does then is, behind the scenes, it installs Psalm and runs a type check on your code that is using my library and tells Composer to not install my library if your code is using my library in the wrong way. Granted, that is very extreme. And there are academic papers out there, or academic articles, I should say, that refer to people like me and Marco Pivetta, who created You Are Using It Wrong, and others, probably also Matt Brown, the creator of Psalm. There are people out there that refer to people like us as typing terrorists. Because we want to type all the things, because we want to have type safety, we want to reason about our software, and we want to be reasonably sure that the types match all the time, because then we have less problems. And then opposed to us typing terrorists are the freedom fighters that do not want to use types anywhere. But I digress. If you like that, then you may also like don't, which is a trait that you can use in your objects to make sure that that object cannot be cloned, it cannot be serialized, it cannot be unserialized, you cannot have magic methods, and so on. And that really closes down your objects and makes your objects more robust. More features, more new features, not just type system-wise. We also have something that developers that prefer more of a functional approach to software development. Arrow functions are new in PHP 7.4. And I have to say that I don't really understand each and every last detail of what this feature is about, but I can show you this example from the RFC, which I understand. And it's all about reducing cognitive load and boilerplate code when you only use very simple anonymous functions or closures. So there is a new keyword, fn, short for function, for arrow function, and then you can achieve the same effect as shown below with less code. Whether or not the above is more readable than the example shown below, I leave that up to you. I don't want to judge that. Now that I have read the RFC, I understand that the thing shown at the top matches the thing shown at the bottom, but whether or not I'm going to use that, I don't know. Another feature that is new in PHP 7.4 is preloading. I talked a little bit about auto-loading earlier. So what auto-loading does is when a class, trait, or interface is used for the first time and it's not yet declared, this callback mechanism is triggered to load the code for the class or unit of code that is to be used. That's nice. We usually use bytecode caches, and these days that means opcache, which became the default standard bytecode cache for PHP. Bytecode caching meaning you do not compile your PHP code into something that the machine can execute on each and every request, but only when the source code has changed. So you save a lot of time because you do not need to compile on each and every request. Makes everything faster. However, we still need to, or PHP still needs to do quite a lot of operations, including I/O operations, when a class is used for the first time within a request. The class is not loaded, the autoloader triggers, the autoloader searches in the worst case for the class source code in the file system. In the best case, it uses an autoload map and just needs to resolve from one key to a source code file and then includes that source code file. And then the bytecode cache realizes I do not need to talk to the disk and actually load that and read that and compile it because I already have it in the cache. Everything I just explained goes away if you use preloading, because with preloading you define these are the source code files that I need in my application. How that usually works is you have a file that looks very similar to a map-based autoloader, like the one that you typically create with the PHP AB tool, the PHP autoload builder, if you create a static class map. You create a preload script and configure that in your PHP configuration file. This is my preload script, and this script is automatically loaded when the process starts. For instance, when your fast CGI worker process starts. And for all requests that are handled by that process, the classes, interfaces, and traits that are loaded, preloaded, are always available, and we can short circuit the autoloader and figuring out whether or not we need to load the class, which makes applications a lot faster. If you want to learn more about that, for instance, how much faster or how you set this up and what that means for how you develop and deploy your applications, my colleague and friend Arne had a presentation about this morning at this conference. Sorry you missed it, in case you missed it. But his presentation material will soon be up on our website at that URL, so you can at least get the slides. I looked at the slides. They are to a large degree self-explanatory because it's configuration examples and example scripts and so on. Lots of information is in there. So have a look at that. And if you have questions, I'm sure that he'll answer them either here at the conference, he's still here until Friday, or just drop us an email and he can answer that. Another new feature in PHP 7.4 is the foreign function interface. And if you need to use functionality from within PHP that is provided by a shared object, like a library that is implemented in C, C++, Go, Rust, whatever, traditionally you would have to write C code that uses that library's functionality and to expose it to PHP, and you had to write a lot of code to map the data that is used by the library to the data structures of PHP, which meant, number one, you needed to be a C developer. Number two, you needed to be able to write C code that interfaces with PHP. All that hurdles are going away with the foreign function interface, where you can just write PHP code and declare in the PHP code the prototype of the functionality that you want to use. In this Hello World style example, we are using the standard C library, libc.so.6, which is on every current Unix system. And we want to use the printf function from that. So for that, we need to provide the prototype. That what would be in the .h header file if we were doing C development. And we just say, okay, the printf function has this name. It has a return value, which is int, and it takes a const char pointer named format as the first parameter, and then a variadic list of parameters after that. The result of that is an object that has the printf function, and we can just call that and use printf from the standard C library directly. Of course, like any Hello World example out there, this is totally pointless, but it fits on one slide. It's totally pointless because PHP already has a printf function, but if you ever needed to deal with functionality that we have many customers, for instance, that have very specific C libraries that they need to interface with to talk to various specific hardware, for instance. And it's a huge maintenance effort to maintain the PHP extension that interfaces with that library. That maintenance is hopefully gone thanks to foreign function interface. And finally, there is not that much that I can tell you about PHP 8 besides how to get ready for it so that when it comes next year, you can use it because you have cleaned up your code. You're no longer using any of these backward compatible, any of these syntax features that are no longer supported. So you're not affected by the backward incompatibility breaks that are introduced with PHP 8. And the only new thing that I can talk about right now for PHP 8 is probably also going to be the biggest one a year from now, which is the just-in-time compiler. Because PHP 8 will once again be a lot faster compared to PHP 7. Probably not on the same scale of 3 times faster from PHP 7 versus PHP 5. But still, it will be faster. It will use less energy, which is always good. But more than that, I cannot say anything about that because we're still finishing PHP 7.4. And slowly but steadily, the feature development for PHP 8 will start in the next weeks or months. There are a lot of RFCs that need to be voted on, or that sometimes some of them have already been voted upon, but the implementation is missing. I'm hoping for some additions to the type system. Union types, for instance, generics would be really nice, things like that. But maybe, not maybe, a year from now we will know more, probably 6 months from now we will know more. Thank you.